Digit, Cade Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. I decided that since this book is so long, and I hate to cram a million hours into one day, rather than do a hurried, tired, ridiculous reading at midnight, practically, on Friday night after work, I thought I would take my time and do an episode, possibly two, of the continuation of our book, The Dawn of Everything, by David Graeber and David Wengrow. I've been working really hard. I finished the book, but I'm warning you, I can't read my handwriting, and I have almost 300 pages of notes. I cannot go back and clean them up. So if I seem a little disjointed at times, it's because it's been so long since I've written the notes that I don't even remember what I've written, and I can't read my handwriting. I will do my best, I promise. I appreciate you bearing with me during this saga. It's just the history of the world. So, this would be episode 6, video number 6. And we had left off, starting talking about Göbekli Tepe. And this is the book that I recommended. It's full of wonderful art and pictures. I mean, look at this. I love a book with colored photographs. So I would strongly recommend it. It's a great book. Oh, introduction by Graham Hancock. That's all you need to know. So let's move forward, plow through this. Göbekli Tepe was one of many as yet unexcavated monolithic centers of the Syrian-Turkish area from the 9th millennia BC. Now, these areas have been remarked upon, noticed. A little bit of it is excavated, but almost all of it is still completely untouched. Nobody knows what's under there. Art has been found there that is fearsome compared to the thematic art that's in the lowland, where they had those clay figurines of animals and women, lots of women, little figurines, almost like, I think, of dollhouse toys. I saw in humble brag, I was in the Italian's National Museum of Archaeology, and it's got the best Egyptian collection outside of Cairo. And one of the things that you read about, and it doesn't really make enough of an impression until you see it in real life, are these little tiny figurines that they made. And they would make a figurine for each person in their village, so that they all look different. They all look like people. They all look individual. They're like little Playmobil people, except with individual characteristics. It's fascinating. This is what they found in the lowlands, but up in the highlands where Göbekli Tepe is, they found these monoliths with really scary looking monsters and mythological kinds of creatures on them, all made of stone and made of absolutely monolithic stone. They have no idea how they got them there. The imagery is almost exclusively of wild, venomous animals, the kinds that are scavengers and predators, mostly male. I don't know how they figured that out. And many of them are shown running off with human heads. And so the question that this begs is, did this culture behead people? Were they into that? So they have found burial sites there with detached skulls, and they have statuary that mocks beheadings, that the statues were built with a head and then were ritually removed. I guess they can tell but how the removal is done, and then the heads are found elsewhere or sitting beside the statue. North of Göbekli is a place called I'm going to mispronounce all of this, I apologize, Kaonu Tapisi, which is a large prehistoric settlement. It has substantial houses that are built on stone foundations, has a number of public buildings. For example, the House of Skulls, which has the remains of more than 450 people. They have 90 heads, and most of these people are young adults or teenagers, and 10 of them are children. They have the skeletons of large prey animals, and cattle skulls are stuck into the walls on the outside. They have a large stone altar with blood from the bodies of humans and many different kinds of animals. They can do DNA now. They've been able to figure this out. The whole place was destroyed in a violent fire and buried, and it was buried intentionally with pebbles and soil. So, nothing but questions. Is this an example of hunting that evolved into dominance over people? Human remains are rare at Göbekli Tepe, but of the remains that they did find, most are the parts of skulls and signs of both decapitation. They can tell, when it's intentional, and what they call defleshing, where they, strip the bones bare. They also found 3 skulls that had holes drilled in them to be hung by strings. I guess if it's a skull and it's being an ornament, it's hung. If it's a person and it's being executed, it's hanged. I said that wrong the other day, and it haunted me all night long because my mother used to really impress upon us. Draperies are hung, people are hanged. But I was actually reading a quote, and that's how they put it, so I forgave myself. So they found in this area, slowly developing, they could tell, scattered pockets of crop raising and animal herding that spread in some large areas from the Mediterranean to the Middle East and across to the Zagros Mountains of Iran. So these were not connected. They weren't in big cities. There were just these pockets of similar kinds of settlements. And they began patterns of life that lasted for millennia, and that they coexisted with the upland cultures that had the great stone monuments and male virility and predators and domination and an ignoring of anything that would be considered female concern. And certain things were traditionally, interestingly, in most cultures considered female. Not everywhere though, but most. Cultivation of gardens, herbs, medicine, weaving, but not everywhere. And I'm trying to think. Oh, pottery, and not everywhere, but they were considered more female pursuits. In the lowlands, they discovered that women were the co-creators of the society, the actual organization of the society. And correspondingly, they're not necessarily saying that it goes hand in hand. They're pointing out that their art was much softer, that it was mostly clay, ceramic type stuff, and fiber art, and very symbolic. So you had these two close cultures, and they know that they interacted. They know that they traded. They know that they interacted. They were aware of each other, and they were acutely aware of each other's differences. In the uplands, Göbekli Tepe's area, there was a huge amount of male predatory violence. And in the lowlands, there was the predominance of female knowledge and symbolism. So, interesting juxtaposition of these two very different cultures. Okay, what do I have here for you? Perhaps the most recognizable and definitely the most macabre objects found in early Neolithic villages of the Levantine corridor. So now we're talking about the area between Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and the Syrian Euphrates. Are skull portraits. These are heads that were removed from burials of men, women, and occasionally children in a secondary process after the corpse had decomposed. Once separated from the body, they were cleaned and carefully modeled over with clay, then coated with layers of plaster to become something altogether different. Shells were often fixed into the eye sockets, just as clay and plaster filled in for the flesh and skin. Red and white paint added further life. Skull portraits appear to have been treasured heirlooms, carefully stored and repaired over generations. They reached their height of popularity in the late 8th millennium BC as Göbekli Tepe fell into decline, when the practice spread as far as Çatalhöyük, and there one such modeled head was found in an intimate situation, clutched to the chest of a female burial. Ever since these intriguing objects first came to light at Jericho in the early 20th century, archaeologists have puzzled over their meaning. But there are literally countless ways one might show respect or grief for ancestors without systematically removing crania from their places of rest and modeling life into them by adding layers of clay, plaster, shell, fiber, and pigment. Even in the lowland parts of the Fertile Crescent, this treatment was reserved for a minority of individuals. More often, human crania removed for burials were left bare, while others had complex histories as ritual objects, such as a group of skulls from Tel Karasa in southern Syria, found to have been deliberately mutilated around the face in what appears to have been an act of post-mortem desecration. And there, just to reemphasize the point that they make throughout this book, oftentimes evidence to be able to extrapolate theories is scant, while at the same time, tons of evidence, 5,000 years of evidence, for example, has been completely ignored. It's very interesting. But let's continue. Traditionally, modern history has settled on an idea that humans evolved from simple foragers, the opposite of farmers, nomadic, collectors of food, renouncing private property, small clans of egalitarian order. And if they show traits of farmers, for example, if they do show that they're sedentary, that they produce foods, that they have private property or inequality, it's because they are becoming farmers and they're in a transitory state. But the evidence, so interesting, the evidence says absolutely otherwise. In the Fertile Crescent, they lived side by side for over 3,000 years and often tried out others' cultural behaviors or strongly rejected them. Agriculture did not mark the origins of rank, of inequality, or property. For example, in the upland, the hunters who were violent and had much inequality, a hierarchical ranked society. And in the lowlands, they were foragers and they cultivated peacefully, lived in peace, and had equality. So Gimbutas, the Lithuanian American, who said that there were peaceful and combinations of cultures living side by side, and that women had a lot to do with it. She was closer to correct than the mainstream prevailing conventional beliefs. And if you have this conversation about this book with somebody who's, I don't know, a tenured history professor or an anthropologist or an archaeologist, sociologist, chances are really good that they're going to disagree with you. They're going to dismiss this stuff, but you just wait. It gets better. Chapter 7, the ecology of freedom. The Fertile Crescent has been studied very much. It's where they said the beginning of farming happened. There was very little war. There was a proliferation of trade. the specialization of crafts, and very much the importance of women in the arts. And it was quite different up in the highlands, and in the uplands they had these monolithic monuments with masculine symbols and symptoms of predatory violence. The first farmers were reluctant to become farmers. How they put it is they avoided committing. They had obviously no one moment of complete transition. They toyed with the notion of farming, and there were sets of implications that said, they're thinking about it, but this wasn't something that, they talk about the agricultural revolution, which we'll get into a little later. No such thing really. Contrary to the evidence that exists, they teach this. But it didn't happen that way. History will argue that farming exploded in popularity and led to inequality. But they do admit that people were inclined to expand agricultural sustainability without privatizing lands, without creating an overseer class, and that they've always found a way to dabble in farming alongside foraging and gathering or hunting. So we have a place called the Russian Mir, M-I-R, which was basically an open field that had communal tenure. In other words, it belonged to everybody, and it was divided into farming plots, and they periodically redistributed the plots so nobody got the best space all the time, and there was cooperative management of pasture land also. And this is very similar to a system from the Scottish Highlands, and it's also found in the Balkans. So there's solid evidence that farming and herding were dabbled in side by side for millennia. Rules of distribution may have differed from culture to culture, and sometimes they were chosen by lottery. So you got the plot that you won, you drew straws or whatever. In 1875, Henry Maine described a rundale, an Anglo-Saxon term, from what he saw as a rundale that existed from India to the highlands. And even up to his own day, he said that there was a periodic shifting among tenant farmers, that they would do a little bit of farming, move on and do something else, come back, move on and do something else. This defies conventional academic belief. This also happened in Germany, it happened in Ireland, it happened in Palestine. So agriculture without private lands and without private ownership existed, and without a departure from egalitarianism. So they would farm communally, they would farm and remain equal because they weren't fighting about property rights. The process seems to be far less unidirectional than conventionally theorized today. There's a lot of new archaeology, and DNA has had a big role to play, and DNA, botanical DNA too, has had a big role to play. Historians used to believe that the geographical nuclei of the family gave a rise to politically centralized societies, and so much evidence that's not true. They speculated that the one led to the other, that food production, people became sedentary, and cities grew up, and surpluses arose, and therefore a population could be supported, and populations grew. But having the surplus created the issues. The invention of agriculture and eventually the surplus and concentrated population became dominated by kings and bureaucrats and priests. That's the theory. In the Fertile Crescent, archaeologists seem to say that there were about 15 centers of domestication of plants and animals, that they went in very different developmental paths. And this is new discovery. These guys are looking at archaeology from Oh, well, there's been a lot of archaeology that's been ignored, but even just going back to the 1950s and to now, but especially in the last 30 years, tons of new discoveries. They're now also realizing that this wasn't just, isolated thing that happened in the Fertile Crescent. It happened in Africa, India, the Pacific Islands, and North America. There's evidence that there was really no reason for food production to lead to the formation of states, that it wasn't an obviously beneficial thing to do. It wasn't the inevitable result. Some groups chose not to adopt farming. I mean, they were fully aware of it. They might have dabbled in it, but it never became a thing. Okay. Just as some regions proved much more suitable than others for origins of food production, the ease of its spread also varied greatly around the world. Some areas that are ecologically very suitable for food production never acquired it in prehistoric times at all, even though areas of prehistoric food production existed right nearby. The most conspicuous such examples are the failure of farming and herding to reach Native American Californian from the U.S. Southwest, or to reach Australia from New Guinea and Indonesia, and the failure of farming to spread from South Africa's Natal province to South Africa's Cape. They chose not to do it. So it wasn't a lack of invention, it wasn't a lack of opportunity, and it wasn't a lack of understanding. Things grew. They just couldn't be bothered. Actually, it reached areas that rejected it consciously. And in the American Southwest, they abandoned a 500-year tradition of growing maize and beans. So for 500 years, they did that. And then they threw it all aside and they returned to foraging with new techniques that they had learned from California. These guys have a better idea. Let's stop all this hard work and let's try their way. Imperial and commercial expansion helped to spread food production and animal domestication techniques far and wide, relatively quickly in modern written historical times. In the Neolithic era, it was an entirely different thing. At the end of the Ice Age, the environments required onerous work to support new techniques, and people avoided them. There were some easier ecological corridors, but in general, it was too hard. Going from the east to the west in Eurasia, as populations moved, it was easier. But if you moved north-south, it was harder. The environments made it more difficult. So how can geography explain history? They bring up all these questions in this book, and they just go off on little tangents. I love it. So they cite Alfred Crosby, who in the 1970s and 1980s wrote about the Columbian exchange of animals, crops like tobacco, potatoes, and turkeys, maize and coffee and horses that caused an ecological imperialism, is how he defined it. Crops from Eurasia did well in North America, and the climate was great, and they didn't have the parasites. They hadn't had time to develop those yet. So they turned native ecosystems on their heads, and North America became a neo-Europa. So, people would have a lot to say about that today, but this is what happened. Also, this exchange, this Columbian exchange, includes infectious diseases. This is the downside. Smallpox and measles were particularly bad, and there was a casualty rate as high as 95% in some Native American communities. The first year colonists came, 95% of some tribes were completely wiped out by disease. So we know there was a lot of back and forth, animals, plants, earlier than 10,000 years ago between all sorts of societies, but how come farming didn't take root, and really develop sooner? Well, archaeological traces show that there are only two periods of sustained warm climate that would support a large agricultural economy. I'm going to get this wrong, Eemian interglacial. 130,000 years ago, there was a slightly warmer temperature than we have right now, and a sustained spread of arboreal forests. There were hippos on the Thames and in the Rhine. And the second time period of a climate warm enough to support agricultural economy is now. And that began 12,000 years ago, and it was called the Holocene. At the end of the Ice Age, things warmed up. It's from the Greek, which means entire new, Holocene. So it's over. It has been for 2 centuries. And we're now entering the Anthropocene. For the first time, human activities are driving global climate change. And we're not going to get into a huge debate about that, but that debate did start in the 1600s. And we look back now, and scientists can't agree. Was it the 1600s? Was it the Industrial Revolution? So the movement of populations and changes in the New World natural agricultural environment increased carbon uptake enough to change the Earth's system and to drive a phase of global cooling. What happened was so many natives died that 50 million hectares of land were abandoned that had previously been cultivated and were allowed to go back to wilderness. And this actually affected the climate. So the movement of Europeans taking over North America began to create environmental changes almost immediately by killing off the natives. At the beginning of the Holocene, there was ice that was still left, and plants abounded, and people followed the plants. So as the ice slowly melted and rich plant life was presented, people followed that. Meeting the ice and rising water created environments for agriculture. But even as the first farmers began, this was also the golden age of foragers, especially on the coast. The glacial retreat left food bonanzas for foragers in the way of like oyster beds and fish, and really increased the sea life. By 8000 BC, humans had caused the extinction of 2/3 of the world's megafauna. Wow. And they were really all ill-suited to the global warming. Hunters went from seasonal mass kills to opportunistic smaller kills in a home range. So they traveled less far. They killed fewer animals at one time. They went from massive tribal hunting. Now, this is a generalization because certainly in different areas things were done differently. But in general, these huge bison kills gave way to single or family hunting groups going out after smaller animals like deer. The hunters went from, I'm sorry, I already read that. Farming was the underdog. So there was what they call an ecology of freedom, the ability of human people for populations to move in and out of farming. Not to give into it full time because it was hard, and to have a food web that wasn't dependent on cultivation. It was an ecological flexibility of freedom. And it's something that humans have done for most of the past, and it's not how I was taught. I was taught, hunter-predator, working with gatherers, foragers, and then suddenly, boom, everybody became agricultural. Not how it happened whatsoever. They practiced things like little kitchen gardens. So that's not growing a huge field full of the same crop. This is growing a garden with medicinal herbs and celery and maybe some flowers, but things you could eat to augment your diet. They also used a form of agriculture called flood retreat. They did landscape management. They would prune wild trees, and they kept some semi-wild animals. And this was typical of human societies globally for thousands of years. Neolithic food production celebrated the biodiversity of their environment. So now we're going to be talking about, they jump around, talking about Neolithic plains of Austria and Germany around 5500 BC, where there was a thing called the linear pottery tradition villages. Among the Central European first farmers, they realized that these villages that had this rich artistic heritage suddenly ended, and they ended in mass graves. They found these huge graves full of bones of all ages with the marks of torture and mutilation, violent death, and a lot of younger women missing. You know what that means. So it had been a free society with very few status differences. The family units lived in timber longhouses, and they noticed that around 5000 BC, these units started to get smaller, and that the grave goods started to change. That's always symptomatic of something going on in a culture. They began to discover large ditches built around the settlements, so obviously some sort of fortification. And then they began to see signs that warfare had happened, and these ditches eventually turned into mass grave sites. The arrival of farming caused an increase in population, and there was a disastrous decrease in the population between 5000 and 4500 BC, like a regional collapse in population quite suddenly. They could see from DNA that some pockets of farming stayed, and there was an intermarriage of those few leftover farmers with foragers. It took another 1,000 years for cereal farming to start up again in this area. So what did the foragers have to do with all of this? After the Ice Age, foragers flourished, especially along the coast, like I said, the seafood. They left cemeteries with richly adorned bodies, lots of amber, and they began to notice a change in these graves. The dead would be buried posed. And usually this sort of ritual posing of corpses indicates some sort of hierarchical relationship to a cosmology. In the bogs, they found decorated skis and sledges, canoes and totem poles, and staffs with elk heads. And those staffs were making connections to later understanding. They were considered signs of authority. So probably the farmers in Central Europe flourished because the area just wasn't interesting to foragers. It's important to remember that we're talking about relative sizes of populations, lots of empty space, and people could just pack up and move. So as the farming communities grew, they spread out, they got closer to the coasts and started to infringe on the foragers' territory. The evidence of farming and women being important in it existed in coastal communities, but also women who were from the farming communities, and they trying to figure out, were they captured, were they there from intermarriage voluntarily, was there raiding, was there warfare? We'll get back to this, but these questions are being placed. There are some success stories from early Neolithic expansion and farming, and around the same time, farming appeared in Africa. Now, we were talking about Austria and Germany. Now we're talking about Africa. And in the Nile Valley, there were not many foragers. And eventually, the foragers that were there all sort of connected communities, and it turned into ancient Egypt. Neolithic communities in this part of Africa were herders, and they traveled widely, and they left cemeteries along the way, and they had a rich tradition of body art and body ornament. So they know that from the graves also. Then you take a look. So we know that there were these herders, not foragers, but eventually they became sedentary. In Oceania, there was a striking dispersal of farming groups from Taiwan and the Philippines all the way in around 1600 BC to Polynesia. So they had built the world's first ocean-going deep-water outrigger canoes and traveled all the way from Taiwan and the Philippines to Polynesia. That's kind of mind-boggling. If you've never read Kon-Tiki by Thor Heyerdahl, what a book. Anyway, they spread the Austronesian language and put down roots on the empty islands of Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. And they also brought with them tubers like taro, pigs, and chickens. They avoided established centers of population on their journey. They were looking for, a fresh start. They left artifacts along the path from original pottery to adoption of new art that they learned from other cultures with shells and bird feathers and leaf weaving mats, that sort of thing, and obsidian. And tattooing became very popular. So here you have three examples: Oceania, Africa, and Central Europe. But they all share two things. They developed a serious commitment to farming. They did a targeted spread to uninhabited land. And unlike serious farmers who had strongly defined boundaries and ethnic and language similarities that they shared, these people in these three different cultures all moved back and forth between good spots. They settled for a while, and then they moved on, and then they settled for a while. And this is seen today reflected in the Amazon, in tribal peoples who move from villages to nomadic bands with the season. They go in and out of farming. And this sort of in and out of farming has been done for thousands of years all across the globe. There was no big explosion of agricultural dominance. There was a toying with agriculture as the mood and the environment and the times dictated. There's evidence that there was not a targeted uniform spread, an interlaced network of cultural exchange, a complex cartography of relations. So they may have set out intentionally looking for empty land and avoiding inhabited land. But eventually, in all three places, what ended up happening was this expanded network of settlements and differing cultures who didn't change for each other, but interacted a lot. And it shows the wide-ranging use of a thing called agroforestry, which is where they burn stuff in the forest to get rid of the dead stuff, or they prune, or they espalier, they'll tie young trees to a support to make them grow a certain way. That may have been somewhat motivated by a desire to avoid the hard work. They wanted no fixed commitments, and it's harder to contain the population. And they did what's called low-level food production, which is just enough to get by. This is seen all over North America, South America, China, and in the Fertile Crescent. So most world farming societies hovered between agriculture and hunting and foraging, and they did this for thousands of years. So why the sudden huge population collapse back in Central Europe, where they saw the bodies in the ditches? There was soil exhaustion and periodic raiding. And the question is, they're extrapolating, did this lead to things like disease and harvest failure? You can't jump from the start to the end of history and ignore the middle. And that's kind of what historians have done. Farming is an economy of deprivation. It's done when there are no other resources, when there's not enough animals to hunt and there aren't enough plants to forage. Well, gosh, I guess we're going to have to grow our own. But what about areas and times of richer environments? In Göbekli Tepe, there are signs of very successful hunter-gatherers, and many population groups built in wood. They didn't leave those stone monuments, so we have to take what we can from what little is left. Stone construction lasts, but the wooden evidence has faded away. Most populations congregated around water where the first cities arose, and so water always comes into play, the damp and flooding, etc. So this is chapter 8, and it's called Imagining Cities. And it's believed that the humans are designed to function best in small groups and not well equipped psychologically to function in large agglomerations of people. We spend most of our evolution, about 95% of our time, in groups no bigger than a few dozen. Almost refuse a scaffolding of bureaucracy to make larger communities work. So therefore, the large groups of settled people led to the rise of the states. This is the belief that required some sort of bureaucratic skeleton to make a big community of people work. This is the belief system of mainstream, and we're going to refute that with evidence, tons of evidence. So you need this bureaucracy to make things work, civil servants, and when that happened, then you would be able to maintain a large population and nurture a successful state. So we meaning academics, for a very long time have thought that this was all supported by the evidence, except in the last 40 or 50 years, there's all sorts of new evidence that disputes this, and they found that ancient cities with no centralized authority and no class hierarchy popped up all over the place and had been there all along, and the evidence was there for the taking. Oftentimes they already knew and they ignored it. So in some, central power appeared, ruled and dominated for a while, and then disappeared, and they went back to a more cooperative form of community. The mere fact of urban life does not imply any particular form of political organization, and that's the assumption that's made today, that cities popped up, therefore this sort of political complexity, administrative complexity, and domination was inevitable. And they're finding now that's not true at all. They say that common sense can be faulty assumptions. For example, it used to be believed that women make bad soldiers because they have lower upper body strength than men, until women started excelling at shooting, that they actually are much better shots than men. And that it was easy for small groups to be egalitarian and come to an agreement. That's what was assumed. And then they found small groups that develop very complicated histories that interfere with decision makings. They're called families. Think about Thanksgiving dinner. Those are not large groups. And there's this burden, this baggage of history between all these people going in many different directions. It's no guarantee that just because it's a small group, you're going to get along. There's a thing called Dunbar's number. Dunbar's number is 150. And Dunbar put forth this notion that the organization of hunter-gatherers and eventually society in general was that it happened in nested groups, like those little Marishika dolls. Is that what they're called? The Russian dolls that sit inside each other. That you started with a family, and then a couple of families or so would be called a clan, and then those clans would live together in bands of residential groups. And the residential groups, the ideal number, the magic number, was 150. That seems to be the most manageable number of human beings living together in peace, in cooperation. And then those residential groups would form tribes and other layers of groups. But today, interestingly, many groups seem to gravitate to the number 150. In the military, brigades, church congregations on an average tend to whittle themselves, unless you have, mega churches. They've discovered that even starting as kin groups, residential groups were often not blood related. So they didn't have to do with the fact that people were related and therefore got along better. The more people you had, the fewer close relationships. No, it didn't have anything to do with that. They found out, as a matter of fact, that only about no more than 10% were actually related kin. And despite the fact that they often call themselves brother and sister. And they're beginning to realize that kinship was a metaphor for social attachment. All men are brothers, even if you hate your biological brother, all men are brothers. So these large kin groups could extend over a huge area, and you could leave a group of your kin, travel 2,000 miles, and find another group of your kin, and they would not be blood related, but you would know by the name of the group that they had the same cultural expectations, traditions, cosmology, whatever, and were required by the rules of kinship to welcome you in. And this existed a lot in North America. We'll get to that. Humans are able to regard a close group of 150 and also huge far-flung groups far away and still feel that kinship. We could feel bound to people that we'll probably never meet, and they extrapolated from that the whole notion of society mostly exists in people's minds. I mean, how many people do you really interact with? You call yourself an American and you relate to being part of American society, but seriously, how many people do you really relate with, not counting COVID, on a regular basis? So cities are never stable in human terms. There's always movement in and out. It's a city, it has a personality, but the people inside it are different. And that's because cities have a life that transcends the constant change of population. And people identify with what the city purports to be, the character it calls itself. So I'm from Chicago, I am a Chicagoan, I am a whatever. So most city dwellers lead sensible, circumscribed lives, rarely go downtown, hardly know areas of the city they neither live nor work in, and see in any sociological meaningful way only a tiny fraction of the city's population. Certainly they may on occasion during rush hour or football games be in the presence of thousands of strangers, but that does not necessarily have any direct effect on their personal lives. Urbanites live in a small social world that touches, but they do not interpenetrate. All this applies in equal measure to ancient cities. Aristotle, for example, insisted that Babylon was so large that 2 or 3 days after it had been captured by a foreign army, some parts of the city still had not heard the news. Imagine that. Where am I? So as cities grow, cultural areas contract, ironically enough. As populations grew and cities grew, people traveled less and less and stayed more sedentary, closer and closer to home. And new archaeology shows that few early cities, 6,000 years ago, they had some cities as big as tens of thousands of people, but few of them had authoritarian control. There was no huge serf class laboring in the fields. Everyone worked together. Cities had diverse ecology of small-scale gardening and animal keeping, with sea foraging and hunting and collecting nearby wild produce. Every region had different characteristics, but the basic idea was the same. But why did the cities first arise? Did seasonal settlements become permanent? And the answer is no, that's not what happened. So what was the early urban world like? You would hear statements of civic unity. There was the planning of buildings on a municipal scale. People began referring to themselves as of the city of Ur. They had founding ancestors, founding gods, city heroes, sort of a cosmology and mythology that rose up. They had a civic infrastructure, ritual calendars with popular festivals that everybody in the city celebrated. Often people from far away would come to the city, but they would often live in special quarters, like the Spanish Quarter or the Chinese area or whatever. They had districts with immigrants that all concentrated in one spot. Well, for example, in the Mexican city of Teotihuacan, they had the Mayan district. These consolidated neighborhoods would have rivalries between each other. And the existence of cities does not imply that necessarily there was technology. So cities existed without metallurgy. Cities existed without wheels. For example, the early Americans had no metal tools, no horses, no donkeys, no camels, no oxen, and they traveled everywhere by foot or boat. This is in North America. The largest early cities in Mesoamerica were not due to technological factors, and they were not due to an agricultural revolution. They were due to ecological factors. So let's see what those were. It's hard to find a single story of how things got set up. Teotihuacan, for instance, appears to have become such a large city, perhaps peaking at 100,000 souls, mainly because a series of volcanic eruptions and related natural disasters drove entire populations out of their homelands to settle there. Ecological refugees. Ecological factors often played a role in the formation of cities. I never really thought about that before. It's interesting. At the end of the Ice Age, the ice melt caused a stabilization of the coasts eventually. Once everything melted, the water level was done. And there was the formation of rich river deltas, and this attracted fish and shellfish and waterfowl, and was really rich soil for planting, and it became a major attraction for human beings to congregate along these coastal areas, coasts also of rivers and lakes as well as ocean. The population congregated and formed urban areas, and then specialized agriculture and animal raising began. It wasn't the opposite way around. Archaeological evidence has been slow to reveal itself because the earliest settlements in the wetlands, and they seem to have been 10 times more widespread than what we thought. A lot of it's been buried in silt. Recently, they found uncovered sunken plazas and monumental platforms 4 millennia older than the Incan Empire in Peru. So we have no idea how huge these settlements were, because they extend under the soil so far and into the water so far, and the studies have not been done. But hugely older than the Incan Empire. Who knew? Also, now that seen that these areas were settled millions of years before any form of authoritarian bureaucracy that we know of, and that we assume would be necessary to the foundation of settlements this size. So we were completely wrong. Recent discoveries in Mayan lowlands show ceremonial centers far bigger than the classic Mayan cities of the kings, and 1,000 years earlier, with no sign of status, no sign of monarchy, and no sign of social stratification. So, wow, I just had no idea. So, how did findings in the Ukraine overturn conventional wisdom on the origins of cities? And when I say the Ukraine, I'm not talking about Ukraine, the country. I'm talking about that widespread area. The prehistory of the Black Sea area is one of elaborate burials of warrior princes. So you know what direction we're going already. With huge grave goods of gold and ornaments and lavish funerals and a mythology around the heroes and, violence. In the 1970s, they discovered megasites, much older and larger than any that had ever been found there, dated to the early or middle 4th millennia BC, that existed long before any cities in Mesopotamia and were much larger than the cities that were in Mesopotamia. These discoveries, were ignored by archaeology or dismissed as overgrown villages. So why is that? Well, the reason is geopolitics. Cold War. They were discovered by scholars of the Eastern Bloc, and the settlements had no politics, no central government, no administration, no ruling class, all the hallmarks of a simple society. And Ursula Le Guin said, we have a bad habit of considering happiness as something rather stupid, that if civilizations are peaceful and show no war and show no stratification and poverty and hierarchy and, domination, well, they must be stupid. This can't possibly have arisen from thought processes. So why do we assume that the absence of signs of arrogance and self-abasement, and by self-abasement, they're talking about a couple of different things. Obeisance to a ruler and a noble class, and also to a priestly class and vengeful gods. Why do we assume the absence of that and cruelty with no rules, no fortifications, no military, no religious sacrifices? Why do we assume that these civilizations are less complex? These Ukraine cities were inhabited for 8 centuries in just this way, with no structures. 4100 BC to 3300 BC, they had no dominant ruling class, no war. They were probably drawn to this particular area because of the rich soil. And it began with people moving east through the Carpathians. The Cucuteni Tripoli culture, never heard of it, was a cohesive cultural group with practices that were found in numerous small villages. They shared artwork, female figurines. They shared food preparation and the kinds of food and the way that they cooked it. These groups settled into megasites that much later became urban areas. They were already recognized as formal communities. They had no central administration, no communal storage, no government buildings, no fortifications, no acropolis. Acropolis usually meaning elevated status, buildings that indicated elevated status of the people who lived there. No civic center, no great baths. Over 1,000 houses of wood and wattle and daub on stone foundations were arranged in concentric circles. I found this fascinating. I didn't know this. This gets really interesting. These settlements are 6 to 9 miles apart and total a population of well over 10,000, but they left very light ecological footprints. Were they only occupied seasonally? Were the people coming and going arbitrarily? They managed to avoid large-scale deforestation of the area. They did small-scale gardening. They cultivated orchards. They had livestock, hunting, foraging, and what's called play farming on a grand scale, which is like large kitchen gardens. They imported salt in bulk. They used flint for their tools. They had a burgeoning household pot industry, which had the finest ceramics in prehistory. They traded far and wide. They used copper from the Balkans. They did possess surplus, but in 8 centuries they had no warfare, no social elites. Significantly, they had strategies to prevent that from happening. I'm going to stop here, and our next video will go into what those strategies were and other examples of prehistoric cultures that we've ignored, that seem to indicate that communities of people could live together communally, truly communally, without military warfare, authoritarian, and patriarchy. Very interesting how they like to avoid that topic. So, Sláinte, and I'll be back very soon.